Glenn, could you describe for us your role and what makes you the best person to quiz on Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama, which we'll be talking about today?
Well, I don't know about the best person, but at Melbourne, and I teach a course at La Trobe University on African American history. And the students are fascinated with Barack Obama. They see him as the breaking free, a ray of hope, all of these things. And I teach, the courses at Melbourne I teach are, I guess, less connected directly with Obama, but one in particular is intimately connected. It's called Searching for the American Dream. The American Dream is something Obama talks about a lot in The Audacity of Hope. I think, it appears in every chapter. And in that course, it's a fieldwork course. We go to America and we talk to people. That sense of place and actually talking to someone rather than reading what they've written, that the theory is brings it all alive. And again, Obama in America is the hot topic, and not everyone is for him. There are a lot of people against him, and there are some people, traditional blue-collar union type of guys who feel a bit left out, perhaps. There are people on the right who vilify him, but he certainly is a hot topic, and he comes up wherever we go. So that's my connection with him.
Okay. So for those of you who haven't yet read Dreams from My Father, it is Barack Obama's journey through the early part of his life, through his search for identity, first as a child in Hawaii, and then through the time he spends as a young man in Indonesia in his teens. He's already a young teenager, through college, and then into his early years doing community work in Chicago. So the book actually wraps up. He goes back at one point to reconnect with his father's heritage in Kenya. So the book wraps up around about 2004, I think, roughly, when he's he's already a senator, but it takes us up to the last sort of part of his community work in Chicago. So we'll maybe a bit later in our discussion talk a little bit about what it means to have written a book like that, and then for us to read it much later when he's in a position like he is today. But going back, I'd like to ask you, Glenn, about, I'm going to call him Barack in this, even though normally I would speak of him as Obama, but because we're talking about his childhood, it feels right somehow to call him by his first name. Can you talk to us a little bit about how typical you think Barack is in terms of his heritage and of being born in the 60s, and what his family make up and how he sits within America socially and culturally at that time?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I think he is incredibly exceptional. He is not the rule. Just the exoticness of a Kenyan father, a Middle American mother, or a mother from that heritage. He's not African American as we would generally use the term.
How would you use that term? What do you mean by that when you say African American?
I simply mean the descendant of one of the Africans who was taken forcibly, sold into slavery, freed after the Civil War, who retain that thread of African culture, but it's become this unique, and they've affected American culture. It didn't just go one way. So that's what I mean by African American, and he is not that. The other thing I was thinking of with this, I'm guessing here, but I suspect when the book was chosen as a VCE text, it was chosen with the idea in mind that here was someone who encounters racism, comes from perhaps a disadvantaged background, and I don't think that's the case either. The disadvantaged part, if they had wanted that, there's 100 books. There's one, The Corner. It won a New York Times Notable Book of the Year award. It's about a group of young African American guys in West Baltimore, which is the meanest place I have ever been to. Poverty levels 90%, drugs, crime, you name it. And they hang out on this corner and they try and achieve the American dream without, I think, a lot of the advantages Obama has. He went to a good school. His mother read to him, which there was a recent, an article in Time magazine about a year ago about the achievement gap, and it suggested that your home life, the mother reading is so important. So he had those things. So I don't think he's typical. I don't think he's certainly not a typical, even if he was African American, he's not a typical African American.
Through much of the period that we're talking about, his father is absent. What impact do you think that had on his developing sense of self as a child and as a young man?
That is sadly more typically African American. The single parent family is the norm, and of those single parent families, it's more likely that the mother, or perhaps even the grandmother, which is the head of the family. Sorry, I'm losing my through. What was the question?
Well, I was asking you about how typical you think his experience was, and about how, and perhaps the absence of his father during that time, and maybe how that related also to his concept of himself as a young black American, and whether, because I think there was quite a few influences later in his life that led him to question those things, but perhaps in his early life, he even says at one point, I think when he's around 5 or 6 years old, he didn't even really understand the concept of racism, which for some people probably would have encountered such things quite a lot earlier, sadly.
Yeah, although again, I think it's learnt, and if those young guys I was speaking about who grew up in West Baltimore, they live in a very segregated city. They would probably not encounter the richer white world in any meaningful way until they were at least in high school. Even then, they would go to a horrible school which was mostly black. Obama, I think, he learns that's what struck me. He learns at the same time. I think they're interwoven. He learns what America should be, could be, and he learns how race can compromise that in his own way. And I think in the end, the good America triumphs in his mind. But I think, I think that is fairly typical. You know, a young kid growing up at home in the neighbourhood, which will probably be mostly African American, is not going to encounter those bars to his progression to achieve the American dream.
Right.
Not at that age, but he'll subtly, gradually learn it.
Yeah.
Like Obama did.
As an aside, what do you think the impact of him spending time in Indonesia was? How did that, that's obviously a very atypical experience for a lot of young 10 or 11-year-olds, but what impact do you think that had on him? He has some very colourful passages where he's describing things like seeing chickens having their heads cut off and being exposed to the poverty and the noise and the chaos of Jakarta in a way that it was completely contrasting to his Hawaii lifestyle. And
again, if you're a poor African American growing up, there's a ghetto, for want of a better word, in Chicago called Cabrini Green, and it's staggering. Apparently you have a 50% chance of reaching puberty without having left Cabrini Green. Now, to me, Barack was exposed to a lot of things that would have been troubling, disturbing to a young child. But he was exposed to a cosmopolitan world that most of these young people his horizons would have been broader. I think it was a good thing. And, it's in the book, as you read the book, it's shaping him. I think he wants to work that through in the book. He wants to work out how he came to be what he was.
Yeah.
And so he addresses things like his time in Indonesia and says, well, how did that shape me?
Yeah, he's got a clear sense of purpose about that, hasn't he?
Yeah.
I think one of the overarching themes of the book, as obvious as it seems, is his search for identity, though, and how he marries the two very different strands of his heritage, whether that's from his white middle American mother or his Kenyan father. And one of the first flashpoints for that, I think, is when he goes to college, and he encounters people that represent all sorts of different kind of polar aspects of what, if he concluded his search for identity, what directions that might take him in. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of people he meets in college and which ideals he feels comfortable embracing and which he finds really are not for him?
I think he on the surface appears as though he's at least flirting with radical politics, radical ideas in college. He's questioning America. But I can't say with certainty what he was, what ism he embraced. And I think I mentioned to you before, I think this relates to the complexity and the sheer intellect of the guy. He is smart and he sees both sides of a question. And all through the book, his roommate at Harvard, a fellow called Julius Janikowski, who's now head of the FCC in Obama's administration, he has said Obama is what he calls an on the other hand type of guy. So he can always see the other side of the argument. And so he flirts with these ideas, he talks with people. There's a passage I remember, he's talking about the overly loud music, the smoking cigarettes, the talking about Marxism. But at times he walks away and says, this is so stupid, this just doesn't relate to everyday life in a meaningful way. So I'm not giving you a definite answer, but I'm not sure there is one there. I really think it's the nature of him that I know when we have a tutorial, first year tutorial, there's always, you're first of all hoping that they talk, and then, you almost break down and weep with joy when someone opens their mouth, and you love the guy. It's usually a guy, and he's very opinionated and he knows all the answers. He's never the one who writes the complex, good essay at the end. The kid who sits there quietly and doesn't contribute because oftentimes they understand that the answer is hard and complex and there's no easy answer, and I think Obama's like that.
You think he was that type of student then? Listening and observing and judging?
I think he'd be the complex, smart student who said a lot somehow. Yeah. The exception to the rule.
Right. He seems to be an exception to the rule at every stage, though, doesn't he? He's quite an extraordinary character. And we talked a little bit before the session about how he also seems to have this amazing ability to be right at the very centre of things, but also maintaining a critical distance from them at the same time. Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that maybe has shaped where his career has gone?
I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, I think that just is a facet of what I've just been talking about. The fact that he won't, even when he is a community organiser in Chicago, which to me was the most interesting part of the book, he's always questioning. He walks away from a meeting and he's analysed everyone else who was there, and he's wondered how useful things were. He's wondering whether he's serving any purpose. He is that slightly detached person all the time. I think you're right, and my explanation is that that's part of his complexity and intelligence, and maybe going back to Indonesia, to Hawaii, where he is an outsider, unlike that typical African American who grows up with a real certainty because they're never going to leave that place, and they know unless they're going to maybe be a great three-point shooter and play for the Knicks, they never will. They feel very connected and embedded, and they wouldn't take that step back. It would be almost impossible, whereas Obama, through his childhood, always is slightly the outsider. And it relates, I guess, to that search for identity. Right. When you're not sure who you are, you're not going to
you're not
relax.
Going to commit, are you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Why for you then, is the Chicago period, you just said that was for you the most interesting part of the book. Why would you describe it in that way?
Well, I think for a lot of reasons. I think a lot of people have likened Obama to Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy was he was the brains. These community organisations, they're called community development corporations. He began the very first one in a tough place in Brooklyn called Bedford-Stuyvesant, just a year before he was assassinated. And he, like Obama, learnt about America's flaws but saw a way out. And he believed in the American dream. But the American dream, Bill Clinton summed it up as saying, if you work hard and you play by the rules, America will give you the chance to get ahead. And Obama early on sees that threatened by race. He's going to work hard, he'll play by the rules, but he realises very quickly that because he's not white, he may not get the reward that should be coming to him. But the American dream isn't just that implies it's a dog-eat-dog competitive fight for success. But there's another side to it, the caring, giving, philanthropic, sharing side of the dream, where people work together. And Bobby Kennedy said, poverty, you're rarely poor alone. You're poor in a poor neighbourhood. So why doesn't the whole neighbourhood work together? And so these organisers, taking that on board, have tried to help facilitate that process. And I think it's a wonderful thing. And it taught him that you can get things done. And it taught him sometimes that you can't. He says in The Audacity of Hope, government can't do everything. Yeah, I think that this is that complexity. He believes in the shared American dream enough to actually go there and do something, which takes courage and commitment. But then he'll say, in The Audacity of Hope, nevertheless, I admire the very, very wealthy in America, and I accept that they got there because of hard work. So, he is complex.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about hope, because it's interesting that in the VCE notes for this text, the book is presented in the context of African Americans having no hope, and this is it's presented as though that's fact, and that's a narrative that is run throughout African American discourse and cultural narratives, and that Obama somehow arrives in this landscape without hope. But you have some different ideas about that, Glenn.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and this I think can be related to Chicago. When I read that sentence, I was just astounded. I think it's so insulting to people. Even when they were slaves, they hoped that they would be freed. They would sing their songs about freedom, and jubilation it was called. You go into a gospel church today and it's intoxicating, the happiness and the hope and the optimism, and all of those great African American leaders, the people Obama read when he was in college, W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X. Malcolm X might have been angry, but he was angry with a purpose. He wanted things to get better, and he thought they could. And Martin Luther King, who had a dream. All of those people, they weren't just throwing up their hands in despair. They were hopeful, and they were committed to making things better. And I think to suggest that African Americans, even when they were in slavery, when they escaped, when they would do things like the master would tell them, pick the cotton, and they would pick it very slowly, or they would pretend to be stupid and burn the cotton, or just some sort of subversive act. All along, they've been hopeful, resilient, fighting. I think in the end, and I don't think Obama was ever despairing. Mm-hmm. You know, he might have been annoyed at what he describes in the book as white arrogance sometimes. But I don't think he gave up hope. And he found in Chicago, there was one passage in the middle of that section where he's saying, I met these people, and what struck me was they lived pretty grim lives, but they were so hopeful, especially the women in that organisation. So that I think, as I say, I was glad you brought that up, because I think that was a strange thing to have in the study guide.
Mm-hmm. And it also, I mean, it leads on nicely, I think, to generational change as well, and the difference of social power and things that a lot of Black Americans experience now, and especially in terms of hip-hop and much more youth culture. Hope and aspirations mean a completely different thing, I think, than they did even a generation ago. So how would you, just to explore that a little bit, how might, aside from the experience of having their father be the president of the United States, how might Obama's kids grow up in a different socio-political environment from what Obama and his wife did and people of his generation did?
That's a very good question, and I think a complex question. I heard one person in the State Department in America, when we go on this student trip, we use Melbourne University's name to open doors, and we go to the State Department, and this person quite candidly said, I think Obama's election is more important to whites who can say, well, see, we can have a black president. Anyone can achieve, log cabin to White House sort of thing. It all works. The system works. African Americans who voted with their feet, voting rates were at a record high. They voted for Obama in record numbers. Almost no one voted Republican, no African American. But I think they're more realistic. I think they don't assume that Obama's presidency means that anyone can make it. Yeah. That they still understand that they have inherited disadvantages. I think the interesting thing is with getting onto youth, they don't necessarily see that tied to race. Race is becoming hugely complex in America, with Asian Americans leading in just about every index, education, income, all of those things. It's complicated again by the fact that over the last 10 years, 80% of Americans have actually seen their incomes fall. And whereas when I was a student, I would have been talking about, are African Americans moving into the middle class as quickly as poor whites? Now you're talking about who's dropping back more quickly or more slowly. It's a very, very grim world, and I think young people are aware of that. For the first time ever, most young people don't think that they'll automatically do better than their parents. So their optimism isn't through rose-coloured glasses, but they have their own culture. Another person in America suggested to me that now you have a youth culture. You don't have black youth, white youth, Asian, Hispanic. You have a youth culture that I do my best. I struggle with hip-hop. I read the lyrics. I don't connect with it. And I think, in a way, that they'd be happy with that.
Right. That's okay.
Yeah. But getting back to your question, I think Obama, as president, confirms to them that they're going to struggle. America is not the golden streets lined, paved with gold place that it once was, and life will be tough. But I don't think that they automatically think that they'll be held back because of race. They understand that if they grew up in a family where the father was poor and dealt drugs and went to prison, and they lived in a horrible little apartment and went to a terrible school and all of those things, and had to work in a fast food joint at a minimum wage, life isn't great. But that's because of 150 years of inherited disadvantage. It's not because, if somehow they got some breaks, I don't think they'd expect to be held back because of race. I know that's a huge statement, and I can't sit here and prove it, and to the extent that I could, it can't be quantified, and there would be a million exceptions, but I think that is the trend. And I say that fully knowing that if you poll white Americans, they think race is less of a problem than if you poll black Americans. There's still, you have to concede that there are problems, but I think it's getting better in that term, in that sense.
So effectively, poverty is still a huge and growing issue, but it's not necessarily as racially defined as it perhaps was a generation ago.
Yeah, and it still overlaps with race, but because of a generation or two or 10 generations of poverty, that's
great. I think we'd like to open it up to questions from the audience in a second. But just before we do that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about. It's quite an interesting perspective to read this book now, knowing where Barack Obama's career has gone. So the edition that I read, he had it wraps up at the end of his period in Chicago, and then the foreword to the book is written a few years later, where he's a senator. But he's not yet president. And in the book, there's some pretty frank admissions about him being quite wayward as a teen, smoking dope, being around people. Even he witnesses somebody taking heroin at one point. I mean, it's a really frank account. And given the way the media is structured, and I mean, he wrote all of this while he was already in politics, but given the way that the media is structured in the US and in the media landscape today, there's some pretty honest portrayals in there. Do you think that he would have written the same book if he'd written it once he'd already reached the presidency, or do you think he would have made some changes?
I think those admissions would have been there, and the American media can be they're pushy, and they probe into private lives in nasty ways, I think. But they're going to do it. And I think he headed off the inevitable expose by doing that. Whether he did it consciously and cynically or not, I don't know. So I think strategically he would have left that there. I think like anyone, comparing it to The Audacity of Hope, I think he's a lot more settled there. I think he was searching in the first book, searching what does my father mean, what does my mother mean, what does my race mean. what will I be? And by book number 2, he's found a lot of those answers, or he's more comfortable with who he is. There's a section in the second book on family, which I don't think he went to Kenya expecting to find answers. In fact, he says quite openly that, you know, he queries what family really means. Is it genetic? Is it contacts? What does family mean? He didn't know. In the second book, he writes about family in a lot more solid, comfortable way. He's anchored in the family he created with Michelle.
Right. I think that's a really interesting difference, though, where in the first book, in Dreams from My Father, the family is something that's reflected in him somehow, whereas obviously later in life he's a father, and so he's created a family round about him. So perhaps that explains that outsider relationship, because again, when he's in Kenya, he's meeting all of these people who are closely blood related to him, but there's again always that distance where he's observing, and he's and there is that very strong sense of a quest and a search. But I think he makes some headway in that search, though. You do feel that when he leaves Kenya, he has met people that he's got a genuine connection with.
I think so. It's an American, perhaps because, like us, they're a nation of immigrants. Americans will go to Ellis Island to see where their great-great-grandparents came into America. The Irish Americans, at least for one day of the year, are more Irish than the Irish. And pretty much everyone at least aspires to make that pilgrimage back home. And pretty much everyone, when they do it, slightly disappointed, like Obama, but they've acknowledged their past, and it's not something to be hidden. You know, there are the people who came on the Mayflower and they're snooty about that, but everyone has a past that's also worthy, and I think he's done that. He won't, again, like when he was a little kid and his father came into the school to give the talk to the class, and for the 24 hours preceding that, he was wishing, the earth would swallow him up and it wouldn't happen. He's no longer embarrassed about his past. He's proud of it in a way. Yeah. But he also he says, I'm not African. I'm American. I'm different to that. But that was my past, and I've
embraced it.
Yeah.
Great. Can we take a question or two from the audience? Does anyone have any questions?
Knowing that he wrote this book not that much before his presidency, do you see any real pure examples that he's taken into his presidency in this book? Like any pure examples?
I think maybe. Well, the section on Chicago is obviously the most relevant. I think he's aware of the problems in these places, and he takes that into his presidency. For instance, healthcare is an obvious example. Another example, he has shifted the emphasis in education spending away from elite universities and towards community colleges, which I think would be far more in touch with the sort of people he was serving working in Chicago. I don't think it was the connections were as clear as in The Audacity of Hope, where he almost lays out a manifesto. But I think there are subtle hints, is all, and more an awareness of problems that he would deal with when he became president.
There's also that moment at college when he gives his first public address where you see that little flash of him sort of being inspired by what it might mean to have an audience to speak to.
That's a good point. I think he learns that.
And there's a wee flash, I think, in there of ego as well. There's an audience that'll listen to me, which is it's another side of his character that he does well to sort of hide, but you can read it in the Dreams from My Father, I think.
That's a very good point. And I mean, he has I think, well, how can you be a politician and not have a huge ego? But yeah, no one's accused him of being humble or...
Right. You've got to have confidence, right?
Yeah, and again, that's, you can see in retrospect where he comes from, but I don't think there are any clear, conscious, well, because of this, I did that when I became president. Now, you might find things, but I didn't read it with that in mind, so...
To wrap up, do you think, just about that thing of perhaps memoir is a subjective, tricky genre, and he, I think, is very honest and frank in his portrayal, but are there any major elements or aspects of his character that you think he does make an effort to hide, or that he's very strategic about? Is there anything in there that if someone else had written a biography of Barack Obama that might have come out that we didn't get from Dreams from My Father? And is there any way really of testing that?
Well, there is a passage at the start of the Chicago section of the book where he says, look, what I'm doing here is, in hindsight, trying to show that my decisions weren't just spontaneous, that my life had a logic to it, that something led to something else, that it has a pattern. And in a way, he was like a historian who tries to smooth things out and make it understandable. He's making it understandable to himself. Whether he did that, and as I was saying, when he's in college, I found it difficult to pin down. He considers different points of view, but I found it difficult to discover what he was. Maybe he's, in retrospect, hedged and said, look, no, that was silly, for 2 months I was an anarchist or something. Let's keep that out. I don't know.
But like you say, the media would probably have dug it out somewhere along the line anyway. So.
Yeah, well, as I said before, they love that. So, but yeah, no, that's all I think. I think he's made sense of something that perhaps, wasn't as smooth and as logical as it appears in the book. But I don't think he may not have written the book later. He may have. I don't know.
But it gives it a much stronger narrative storyline as well, though. I think once he kind of shuffles everything to make it logical and progressive that way, it's a better read, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.